The land lay bare. A vast, empty canvas of loss under a muted sky. Scars marked the earth, remnants of a life once lived. Broken homes, shattered glass, fragments of dreams scattered like dust. The wind whispered through the silence. A lonely echo of a community vanished. But even in this desolation, life endured. A single olive tree stood defiant. Its branches, twisted and gnarled by time and hardship, reached towards the heavens. A testament to the resilience of nature, and a mirror to the spirit of the people who once called this place home. This is a land that has known great suffering, a land steeped in the weight of history. Yet, it is also a land where hope takes root, where the human will refuses to be broken. This is a story about that resilience, that unyielding spirit that refuses to be silenced. It is a story about loss, about the pain of displacement, the shattered dreams of a people caught in the crossfire of a conflict that has spanned generations. It is a story about Palestine.
Zionism, a movement advocating for a Jewish homeland in Palestine, emerged in response to centuries of anti-Semitism in Europe. Theodor Herzl, a Jewish journalist from Vienna, is considered the father of modern Zionism. He published Der Judenstaat in 1896, arguing for a Jewish state. Zionist organizations promoted Jewish immigration to Palestine, then part of the Ottoman Empire. Their determination laid the groundwork for the future establishment of Israel. World War I dramatically reshaped the geopolitical landscape of the Middle East, creating both opportunities and challenges for the Zionist movement. The Ottoman Empire, which had sided with the Central Powers, was on the verge of collapse. The victorious Allied powers, particularly Great Britain and France, sought to redraw the map of the region, dividing it into spheres of influence. The Balfour Declaration, issued by the British government in 1917, marked a significant turning point for the Zionist movement. In this declaration, Britain expressed its support for the occupation in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. This declaration was welcomed by Zionists, crooks worldwide, as a major step towards achieving their goals. However, it also raised concerns among the Arab population of Palestine, who feared being marginalized in their own homeland. The Balfour Declaration set in motion a complex and often contradictory series of events that would shape the future of the Middle East. The end of World War I saw a surge in Jewish immigration to Palestine, now under British administration. This influx of immigrants, many of whom were fleeing the aftermath of the war and rising anti-Semitism in Europe, heightened tensions with the Arab population. The British Mandate authorities faced the daunting task of balancing the aspirations of occupation, Jews and Arabs, a task that proved increasingly difficult as time went on. The interwar period was marked by growing unrest, with clashes between occupation Jews and Arabs becoming more frequent and violent. The Zionist movement continued to grow in strength, establishing institutions and infrastructure in Palestine, laying the groundwork for a future state and dictatorship. The Jewish Agency, established in 1929, played a key role in coordinating immigration, land purchase and development projects. The Haganah, a Jewish paramilitary organization, emerged to protect Jewish occupation land from Arab attacks, foreshadowing the armed conflicts that would later engulf the region. The interwar period was a time of both hope and trepidation for the Zionist movement, as it navigated the complex realities of building a nation in a land already inhabited by another people. The rise of Nazi Germany in the 1930s cast a long shadow over Europe, particularly for its Jewish population. Adolf Hitler's ascent to power in 1933 ushered in a period of unprecedented persecution and terror, culminating in the Holocaust. The Nazis' ideology of racial hatred singled out Jews as enemies of the state, subjecting them to discriminatory laws, economic boycotts, and ultimately, mass murder. In 1935, the Nuremberg Laws were enacted, stripping Jews of their citizenship and fundamental rights, marking a dark chapter in history. Ironically, decades later, some argue that the victims of such tyrannical laws have become enforcers of similar oppression. The policies imposed on Palestinians by the Israeli occupation forces bear unsettling parallels to those restrictive regulations, raising questions about history repeating itself in tragic ways. The Kristallnacht pogrom in November 1938 marked a terrifying escalation of Nazi persecution. The Havara Agreement, signed in August 1933, aimed to facilitate the emigration of German Jews to Palestine by allowing them to transfer a portion of their assets. It represented a collision of interests: the desperate need of German Jews to escape Nazi persecution and the Zionist aspiration to build a Jewish homeland. Amidst this climate, the Havara Agreement offered a glimmer of hope, enabling German Jews to transfer some assets to Palestine, providing vital capital for the Jewish community and meeting British mandate immigration requirements. The Havara Agreement, a complex financial arrangement, involved a series of intricate transactions between German Jewish emigrants, Zionist organizations, and the Nazi regime. The process began with German Jews depositing their assets, often at a significant loss, into a designated account in Germany. These assets, ranging from cash and securities to personal property, were then liquidated within Germany. The proceeds from these liquidations were transferred not directly to the emigrants but to the Anglo-Palestine Bank in Palestine, a key institution in the Zionist movement's efforts to build a Jewish homeland. In Palestine, the Anglo-Palestine Bank used these funds to purchase German goods such as agricultural equipment, building materials, and manufactured products, which were then shipped to Palestine. This intricate barter system, while seemingly convoluted, served multiple purposes. For German Jews, it provided a means of salvaging a portion of their assets and obtaining entry permits to Palestine, albeit at a steep price. For the Zionist movement, the agreement provided much-needed capital for development projects and economic growth in Palestine, bolstering the fledgling Jewish community. The Havara Agreement, however, did not operate in isolation. It was embedded within the broader context of German economic policy under the Nazi regime. Germany, seeking to circumvent international boycotts and expand its trade, saw the agreement as a way to access new markets and acquire essential raw materials. The agreement, therefore, served the dual purpose of facilitating Jewish emigration while simultaneously advancing Nazi Germany's economic interests. The mechanics of the Havara Agreement, while seemingly technical in nature, had profound human consequences. For the estimated 50,000 German Jews who emigrated to Palestine under its provisions, the agreement represented a lifeline, a chance to escape persecution and rebuild their lives. However, the agreement also raised troubling ethical questions about the nature of cooperation with a regime actively engaged in the persecution of Jews. The Havara Agreement, therefore, remains a subject of historical debate, a stark reminder of the agonizing choices faced by individuals and communities confronted with unimaginable circumstances. The Havara Agreement, while seemingly contradictory given the Nazi regime's virulent anti-Semitism, served a number of strategic purposes for the Third Reich. The agreement, from the Nazi perspective, was not about altruism or aiding Jewish emigration. It was a calculated move driven by a complex interplay of economic and ideological considerations. At its core, the agreement provided the Nazi regime with a tool to circumvent international boycotts of German goods, a growing concern for a government intent on economic self-sufficiency and expansion.
The boycott movement, initiated by Jewish organizations and sympathizers worldwide, aimed to exert economic pressure on the Nazi regime in response to its persecution of Jews. The Havara Agreement, by creating a demand for German products in Palestine, provided a much-needed outlet for German exports. This circumvention of the boycott, however morally troubling, aligned with the Nazi goal of achieving economic autarky, reducing Germany's dependence on foreign trade and strengthening its position on the world stage.
Beyond economic considerations, the Havara Agreement also served the Nazi regime's ideological agenda, albeit in a more indirect manner. The agreement, by facilitating Jewish emigration, provided a veneer of legitimacy to the Nazi claim that it was not seeking to exterminate Jews, but rather to encourage their emigration from Germany. This propaganda narrative, carefully crafted for both domestic and international consumption, aimed to deflect criticism and portray the Nazi regime as a rational actor pursuing a policy of separation rather than genocide. The Havara Agreement, therefore, must be understood within the broader context of Nazi Germany's multifaceted approach to the Jewish question. The agreement, while seemingly anomalous given the regime's ultimate goal of Jewish annihilation, served as a useful tool in the Nazi toolkit, advancing its economic and propaganda aims. The agreement's existence, however, does not negate or diminish the horrors of the Holocaust. Rather, it highlights the cynical and manipulative tactics employed by the Nazi regime in its pursuit of power and racial purity. The Havara Agreement sparked controversy and fierce debates within Jewish communities worldwide. It offered a lifeline to some German Jews, but was fraught with ethical dilemmas. Critics argued that any cooperation with the Nazi regime amounted to a moral compromise. The debate exposed deep divisions within the Jewish community. Some believed the agreement saved lives and strengthened the Jewish community in Palestine. Others viewed it as a dangerous precedent that condoned Nazi policies. The ethical dilemmas were deeply personal for those faced with the choice of participation. For some, it was the only viable escape route. For others, the moral cost of collaboration was too high. The Havara Agreement remains a stark reminder of the complexities of moral decision-making in times of crisis. Many countries closed their borders to Jewish refugees, leaving Palestine as one of the few viable destinations. The Havara Agreement offered a glimmer of hope to escape Nazi tyranny and rebuild lives in a potential Jewish homeland. The moral quandary: to cooperate or to resist. The Havara Agreement ignited a firestorm of debate within Jewish communities worldwide. Could cooperation with Nazi Germany ever be justified, even if it meant saving Jewish lives? Jewish leaders faced an impossible position, caught between conscience and responsibility. The agreement, for many, represented a moral Rubicon that should not be crossed. The moral dilemma lay in weighing lives saved against the cost of collaboration. The Havara Agreement stands as a stark reminder of the complexities of moral decision-making in times of crisis. Voices of dissent, opposition to the Havara Agreement. The Havara Agreement faced immediate and vociferous opposition from a diverse coalition of voices within Jewish communities worldwide. Dissenters argued it played into Nazi propaganda, providing a convenient narrative of Jewish emigration. Critics, having witnessed Nazi brutality, refused to aid the Nazi agenda. They believed the agreement sent a dangerous message, suggesting Nazi openness to negotiation. Some Zionists argued it contradicted their ethos of self-reliance and resistance. The voices of dissent ensured the moral dimensions of the agreement were not ignored. The Palestinian perspective, a story untold. The narrative surrounding the Havara Agreement often focuses on the perspectives of German Jews, Zionist leaders, and the Nazi regime, neglecting a crucial voice, that of the Palestinian people. While the agreement aimed to facilitate Jewish emigration to Palestine, it did so within the context of British Mandate rule, a period of growing tensions between the Jewish and Arab populations. The influx of Jewish immigrants, while bolstering the Zionist project, also contributed to Palestinian displacement, economic marginalization, and political disenfranchisement, factors that would have profound and lasting consequences. The Havara Agreement, viewed through a Palestinian lens, represents a complex and often painful chapter in their history. While the agreement itself did not directly cause Palestinian displacement, it occurred within a broader historical context marked by land acquisition, settlement expansion, and escalating conflict between the Jewish and Arab communities. The influx of Jewish immigrants, facilitated in part by the Havara Agreement, exacerbated existing tensions, contributing to a sense of anxiety and resentment among Palestinians who felt their homeland slipping away. The Palestinian narrative of this period is often overshadowed by the horrors of the Holocaust, a tragedy of unimaginable proportions that rightly demands our attention and remembrance. However, it is essential to acknowledge that the pursuit of a Jewish homeland, while understandable in the face of anti-Semitic persecution, had a profound impact on the lives of Palestinians, many of whom experienced dispossession, displacement, and the loss of their own dreams for self-determination. The Havara Agreement, therefore, serves as a reminder that history is rarely neat or one-sided. It challenges us to engage with multiple perspectives, to acknowledge the complexities of the past, and to recognize that even well-intentioned actions can have unintended and often painful consequences. A comprehensive understanding of the Havara Agreement requires not only an examination of its impact on German Jews and the Zionist movement, but also an acknowledgement of its place within the broader Palestinian narrative, a story of dispossession, resilience, and the ongoing struggle for justice and recognition. The year 1948 marks a cataclysmic turning point in Palestinian history, a year etched in collective memory as the Nakba, meaning catastrophe in Arabic. This pivotal moment witnessed the violent dispossession of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians from their ancestral homeland. It saw the systematic destruction of their villages, the fragmentation of their society, and the beginning of a decades-long struggle for recognition, return, and justice. The Nakba was not an isolated event, nor was it an inevitable outcome of ancient religious conflicts. It was a deliberate and planned ethnic cleansing campaign executed by Zionist forces, aiming to create a Jewish state in Palestine, irrespective of the indigenous population already residing there. This documentary will delve into the historical context leading up to the Nakba, unveiling the policies and actions that culminated in this tragedy. The Nakba is not a distant memory confined to history books. Its legacy continues to shape the lives of millions of Palestinians today, living as refugees, denied the right to return to their homes or under Israeli military occupation. Understanding the Nakba is crucial to comprehending the ongoing Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the Palestinian struggle for self-determination. This essay will highlight the plight of the Palestinian people, the deliberate displacement they endured, and the enduring quest for justice that defines their narrative. It's a story of loss, resilience, and the unwavering pursuit of a just and lasting peace. The Nakba also represents a cultural catastrophe as it disrupted the rich tapestry of Palestinian life, traditions, and heritage. The displacement scattered communities, leading to a loss of cultural continuity and the erosion of traditional practices. Yet despite the dispersal, the Palestinian diaspora has managed to preserve and celebrate their cultural identity across the globe. Through literature, music, and art, Palestinians continue to express their connection to their homeland and their enduring hope for return. The Nakba has also galvanized international solidarity movements, with people around the world standing in support of Palestinian rights. Various international bodies and human rights organizations have called for the recognition of Palestinian rights and the implementation of UN resolutions. Educational programs and academic conferences continue to shed light on the Nakba, ensuring that this pivotal event is not forgotten. Palestinian youth, both in the homeland and in the diaspora, are using social media and activism to raise awareness and advocate for their cause. Despite the ongoing challenges, the resilience of the Palestinian people remains a testament to their enduring spirit and determination. As we look to the future, the hope for a just resolution and lasting peace continues to inspire Palestinians and their supporters worldwide. The Nakba is not just a historical event. It is a living narrative that continues to shape the identity and aspirations of the Palestinian people. Through understanding and acknowledging this profound tragedy, we can contribute to a future where justice, peace, and dignity prevail for all. Before the Nakba, Palestine was a land teeming with life. Its streets were filled with the sounds of merchants calling out their wares, children playing, and neighbors greeting each other. The air was thick with the aroma of spices, fresh produce, and the scent of the sea. From the bustling coastal cities of Jaffa and Haifa, where the ports were gateways to the world, bringing in goods and ideas from distant lands, to the fertile agricultural lands of the Galilee and the Negev desert. where farmers worked tirelessly to cultivate the land, ensuring bountiful harvests year after year. Palestine was home to a diverse and vibrant society. Communities thrived, with people of different backgrounds and faiths living side by side, sharing in each other's joys and sorrows. Arab Palestinians, the majority population, had cultivated a rich tapestry of life over centuries, deeply rooted in the land. Their traditions, passed down through generations, were a testament to their enduring connection to their homeland. Palestinian cities and towns were centers of commerce, culture, and intellectual exchange. Markets buzzed with activity, and cultural events brought people together, fostering a sense of community and shared identity. Jaffa, with its ancient port, served as a gateway to the world, its markets brimming with goods from across the Mediterranean. The city's strategic location made it a hub of trade and cultural exchange, enriching the lives of its inhabitants. Jerusalem, a holy city for three faiths, resonated with religious and cultural significance, its ancient streets echoing with the prayers of Muslims, Christians, and Jews. Pilgrims from around the world flocked to its sacred sites, adding to the city's vibrant tapestry. Rural Palestine was a mosaic of agricultural villages, each with its own unique character and traditions. These villages were the heart of Palestinian life, where families worked the land and celebrated their heritage. Farmers diligently tended their olive groves and citrus orchards, their livelihoods intertwined with the land. The fruits of their labor were not just a source of sustenance, but also a symbol of their deep-rooted connection to their homeland. Skilled artisans crafted intricate pottery, textiles, and olive wood carvings, reflecting the rich artistic heritage of the Palestinian people. Their craftsmanship was renowned, and their works were cherished both locally and beyond. Palestinian society, though diverse in its religious and cultural expressions, was bound by shared experiences and a deep connection to the land. Festivals and religious ceremonies were occasions for communal celebration, reinforcing the bonds that held society together. Families had resided in their villages for generations, their histories woven into the very fabric of the land. Each home, each tree, and each stone held stories of the past, passed down through the ages. This vibrant tapestry of Palestinian life was about to be torn apart by the forces of Zionism and the events leading up to the Nakba. The rich, diverse, and deeply rooted communities would face unprecedented challenges, forever altering the course of their history. In 1947, the United Nations established the United Nations Special Committee on Palestine, UNSCOP, to investigate and propose solutions. The committee met with representatives from both Jewish and Arab communities, revealing deep-seated animosity and competing claims. The Jewish representatives argued for an independent Jewish state, while the Arab representatives insisted on a unified Arab state. In August 1947, UNSCOP recommended the partition of Palestine into two independent states, one Jewish and one Arab, with Jerusalem under international control. The plan allocated 56% of the land to the Jewish state and 43% to the Arab state, with Jerusalem as a corpus separatum. The plan also proposed economic cooperation between the two states. The UN partition plan received mixed reactions. The United States and the Soviet Union supported it, while the Arab League rejected it outright. Jewish leadership accepted the plan, seeing it as an opportunity to establish a Jewish state. The UN partition plan inadvertently sowed the seeds of further discord. The Arab rejection and escalating violence foreshadowed a bloody conflict. The British withdrawal left a power vacuum, leading both sides to arm themselves. The UN partition plan ignited violence in Palestine. Jewish paramilitary groups clashed with Arab militias, leading to widespread fear and bloodshed. The breakdown of order paved the way for a full-blown civil war. By late 1947, sporadic violence escalated into full-fledged armed conflict. Jewish forces implemented Plan Dalet, aiming to secure territory and expel Arab inhabitants. The Palestinian Arabs, outgunned and outmaneuvered, faced a bleak future. The first half of 1948 saw intense fighting, with Jewish forces making significant territorial gains. The Palestinian Arab population began to flee, marking the start of the Nakba. The conflict left a legacy of trauma and mistrust. In May 1948, neighboring Arab states joined the conflict, marking the First Arab-Israeli War. The IDF launched counter-offensives, expanding territory under its control. The war resulted in the displacement of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians. The Deir Yassin massacre in April 1948 cast a long shadow over the Palestinian exodus. Jewish paramilitary forces attacked the village, killing many civilians. The massacre amplified fear and panic, accelerating the Palestinian exodus. In July 1948, the Israeli army launched Operation Dani, capturing Lydda and Ramle. The town's Palestinian inhabitants were forcibly expelled. This act of ethnic cleansing aimed to secure a Jewish demographic majority. The massacres at Deir Yassin, Lydda and Ramle, along with other acts of violence committed against Palestinian civilians, had a profound impact on the course of the Nakba. These events, etched in the collective memory of the Palestinian people, created a climate of terror and desperation. They served as a stark warning: stay and face potential annihilation, or flee and hope for a chance at survival. The psychological impact of these atrocities was devastating. Palestinians who had called this land home for generations were suddenly uprooted, their lives shattered, their sense of security and belonging violently ripped away. The trauma of these events reverberated through families and communities, leaving deep scars that would transcend generations. The massacres became a tragic symbol of the Palestinian people's dispossession, fueling a narrative of loss, displacement, and injustice. The massacres also had a significant impact on the international community's perception of the conflict. While the events were widely condemned, they failed to generate sufficient international pressure to halt the violence or prevent the expulsion of Palestinians. The international community, still grappling with the aftermath of World War II and the complexities of the Cold War, struggled to find a cohesive response to the unfolding crisis in Palestine. Village destruction erasing Palestine. The year 1948 witnessed not just the displacement of a people, but a systematic attempt to erase their presence from the land. As Israeli forces advanced, a wave of destruction swept across Palestinian villages, transforming vibrant communities into fields of rubble and ruin. Over 500 villages, once alive with the rhythm of daily life, were systematically razed to the ground, their destruction a chilling testament to the ruthlessness that characterized the Nakba. The methods employed were as varied as they were brutal. Homes were looted, then dynamited or bulldozed, their remnants left as a grim warning to those who had fled. Mosques and churches, symbols of faith and community, were not spared, their destruction a blow not just to the physical landscape, but to the spiritual heart of Palestine. Fields and orchards, cultivated for generations, were laid waste. The lifeblood of Palestinian livelihood choked out. The destruction was not random, it was a calculated strategy aimed at preventing the return of the displaced Palestinians. By erasing villages from existence, the Israeli authorities sought to create a new reality on the ground, one where the Palestinian presence was erased, their claims to the land rendered invisible. The destroyed villages became stark reminders of the human cost of conflict, their absence a gaping wound in the Palestinian collective memory. Amidst the chaos and brutality of the Nakba, disturbing allegations emerged of a more insidious tactic employed to drive Palestinians from their land: the poisoning of water sources. While historical evidence remains inconclusive and contested, the allegations themselves speak to the depths of fear and desperation that gripped the Palestinian population. The very notion of poisoning wells, a source of life and sustenance, evokes a visceral horror, a violation not just of human life, but of the sanctity of nature itself. Palestinian survivors recounted stories of wells being contaminated with unknown substances, their once clear waters turning murky and foul-smelling. Rumors spread of livestock dying after drinking from poison wells, of villagers falling ill with mysterious ailments. Whether grounded in reality or born out of fear, these stories instilled a deep sense of vulnerability, undermining the basic trust necessary for survival. The alleged poisoning of wells served as a psychological weapon, amplifying the terror that fueled the Palestinian exodus. Even if not widespread, the very possibility of such acts created an atmosphere of suspicion and dread. It transformed a basic human need, access to clean water, into a source of fear and uncertainty. The wells, once symbols of life and community, became potential instruments of death, further eroding the Palestinian sense of security and belonging. Rape, torture and terror, the dark underbelly of war. The Nakba unleashed violence far beyond the battlefields. A darker cruelty unfolded, targeting the most vulnerable: women, children and the elderly. Rape and torture became grim weapons of war, breaking the spirit of the Palestinian people. Palestinian women faced the added terror of sexual assault. Survivor accounts paint a harrowing picture of systematic rape. These acts left deep psychological scars, shattering lives and families. The silence speaks to the stigma and shame associated with sexual violence. Torture, both physical and psychological, was used to instill fear and crush resistance. Palestinian men were subjected to beatings, mutilations, and mock executions. The methods were designed to break the body and spirit. Children carried the trauma into adulthood, their futures marked by violence. The Nakba reveals the darkest underbelly of war, where cruelty becomes commonplace. These acts left an enduring legacy of trauma and mistrust, poisoning relations for generations. Acknowledging these crimes and seeking justice is essential for healing and building a future based on respect and human dignity. By the time the guns fell silent in 1949, a staggering transformation had gripped Palestine. The Nakba, the catastrophe, resulted in the displacement of 750,000 Palestinians, forced to flee their homes in the face of violence and fear. It was a mass exodus from their ancestral land, a tragedy etched in history. Some fled due to violence, others were expelled by Israeli forces aiming to create a Jewish demographic majority. Psychological warfare and rumors also played a role. The exodus unfolded in waves, each surge fueled by new violence or fear. Families were torn apart, their journeys marked by hardship. Some fled on foot, others in overcrowded trucks. The world watched, seemingly powerless. The 1948 exodus stands as a stark reminder of the human cost of conflict, a testament to the devastating impact of displacement. The flight of 750,000 Palestinians marked the beginning of a new chapter, one defined by exile, dispossession, and the enduring struggle for recognition and justice. For the displaced Palestinians, finding refuge often meant trading one form of hardship for another. Many found themselves herded into makeshift camps in neighboring countries like Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, and the Gaza Strip. These camps, initially temporary, became semi-permanent, their overcrowded tents a stark contrast to the homes they left behind. Life in the camps was defined by deprivation, uncertainty, and the struggle for survival. Basic necessities like food, water, and sanitation were often scarce. The loss of their homes left the refugees feeling adrift, their sense of identity shattered. The camps often became breeding grounds for frustration and a deep sense of injustice. Despite the hardships, the Palestinian refugees displayed remarkable resilience, clinging to their traditions and collective memory. The Nakba, the catastrophe of 1948, is not just history. It is a living reality, a wound that continues to bleed, a source of profound grief and anger. Over 750,000 Palestinians were displaced, their villages destroyed, and their right to return denied. The 1956 Suez Crisis was a pivotal moment in Middle Eastern history. It began with a bold move by Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser.
I decided to nationalize the Suez Canal.
This waterway was a lifeline for global trade, controlled by a Western consortium. Nasser's decision sent shockwaves through the world, especially in London and Paris.
The nationalization of the Suez Canal was a matter of national pride for Egypt. The canal was a symbol of Western colonialism. Our move was seen as a declaration of independence.
For Britain and France, it was a direct threat to their economic and strategic interests. The canal was vital for oil transportation from the Middle East to Europe. The British and French governments reacted with fury, determined to regain control.
What followed was a chain of events that would have far-reaching consequences, particularly for the Palestinian people.
The nationalization of the Suez Canal was met with outrage in London and Paris. British and French leaders viewed it as an act of aggression. They saw Nasser as a dangerous demagogue who needed to be removed from power. The British and French governments immediately began to plan for military intervention. They were determined to topple Nasser and regain control of the canal. Prime Minister Anthony Eden of Britain and Premier Guy Mollet of France saw this as a test of their resolve. However, direct military action carried significant risks. It could spark a wider conflict in the Middle East, potentially drawing in the Soviet Union. The British and French needed a way to mask their involvement and legitimize their actions. They found a willing partner in Israel, which had its own grievances against Egypt. The Israelis seized the opportunity to strike a decisive blow against their adversary and strengthen control over their southern occupied border. In the autumn of 1956, a secret agreement was reached between Israel, Britain, and France. This clandestine pact, known as the Tripartite Agreement, planned a coordinated military campaign against Egypt. Israel would launch a surprise attack on the Sinai Peninsula. Britain and France would then intervene to protect the Suez Canal. The agreement was driven by self-interest and Cold War paranoia. Britain and France aimed to preserve their influence in the Middle East. Israel sought to eliminate the threat posed by Egypt. The true nature of the collusion, however, was far from noble. On October 29, 1956, the Israeli occupation military forces launched a surprise attack on Egypt. Codenamed Operation Kadesh, the invasion marked the beginning of the Suez Crisis. Israeli forces, spearheaded by armored units, rapidly advanced across the Sinai Peninsula, overwhelming Egyptian defenses.
The Israeli offensive was swift and brutal. Egyptian forces, caught off guard, were routed. Within days, we had captured the Sinai Peninsula, reaching the eastern bank of the Suez Canal.
The Israeli Air Force bombed Egyptian military targets relentlessly, while also targeting civilian infrastructure in the Gaza Strip. The invasion of the Sinai Peninsula was accompanied by a wave of violence against Palestinian civilians. Israeli forces, seeking to secure their flanks and prevent any resistance, committed atrocities against the Palestinian population. The Gaza Strip, densely populated by Palestinian refugees, suffered heavy bombardment. The attacks on Gaza sowed the seeds of future conflict and resentment. Global outcry: Eisenhower's veto. The tripartite aggression against Egypt sparked international outrage. The United States condemned the invasion.
I was furious at being kept in the dark. This invasion threatened to destabilize the Middle East.
Eisenhower refused to support the Anglo-French-Israeli action. He believed it undermined international law. The US and Soviet Union demanded a ceasefire and withdrawal of troops.
The pressure forced Britain, France, and Israel to back down. They agreed to a ceasefire on November 6, 1956. The withdrawal was completed by December 22nd.
The Suez Crisis marked a turning point in the post-war order. Gaza's agony, a humanitarian catastrophe. The Suez Crisis had a devastating impact on the Palestinian people, particularly in the Gaza Strip. The Israeli invasion and subsequent occupation displaced thousands of Palestinians. Many fled their homes in fear of Israeli reprisals, seeking refuge in neighboring areas.
The Israeli military administration imposed strict control over the Gaza Strip. Movement was restricted and economic activity was severely hampered.
The United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees in the Near East, or UNRWA, struggled to cope with the influx of displaced persons and the growing demand for food, water, and medical supplies. The crisis exacerbated the plight of Palestinian refugees, many of whom had already endured years of hardship and uncertainty.
The Suez Crisis left a deep scar on the collective memory of the Palestinian people.
The shadow of Suez, Israel's military posture. The 1956 Suez Crisis had a profound impact on Israel's military posture. The swift victory over Egypt emboldened the Israeli military establishment. It reinforced their belief in the efficacy of preemptive strikes and offensive operations. The crisis also led to a significant increase in military aid to Israel, primarily from the United States. This influx of weaponry and advanced technology further fueled Israel's oppressive military apparatus, tightening their authoritarian control over the occupied territories. It enabled Israel to cling to its power-hungry ambitions, constantly striving to outmatch its Arab neighbors and feed its insatiable desire for dominance. The Suez Crisis fed Israel's relentless pursuit of power, shaping their opportunistic and bottom-feeding strategic mindset. It underscored Israel's ruthless obsession with forging manipulative external alliances and bolstering an intimidating military deterrent to impose its will on others. Israel's leaders schemed in the shadows, concluding that they couldn't trust international diplomacy alone, opting instead for underhanded tactics to secure their power at any cost. The armistice lines became more than just borders on a map. They became stark reminders of the power imbalance in the region. Israel, with international recognition and support, flourished, while Palestinians struggled for basic rights and recognition. It failed to address the core issues of Palestinian displacement and the deep-seated mistrust between the two sides. Border clashes, cross-border raids, and a constant atmosphere of suspicion became the norm in the years following the 1948 war. Israel, determined to secure its existence, adopted a security-first approach, often at the expense of Palestinian rights and aspirations. Into this volatile mix stepped Gamal Abdel Nasser, a leader who embodied the aspirations of a pan-Arab movement seeking to reclaim its dignity and strength. Nasser's message resonated far beyond Egypt's borders, galvanizing Arabs across the region who felt humiliated by Israel's military victories. He offered a vision of a united Arab front capable of confronting Israel's expansionist ambitions and reclaiming Palestinian rights. He forged alliances with other Arab states, strengthened Egypt's military, and nationalized the Suez Canal in 1956, a move that sent shockwaves through the international community. Gamal Abdel Nasser's vision extended beyond mere political alliances. He tapped into a deep-seated yearning for Arab unity. He recognized that a united Arab world, standing shoulder to shoulder, could reshape the geopolitical landscape and challenge Israel's grip on the region. Nasser's charisma and his message of empowerment resonated deeply with a generation scarred by colonialism and yearning for self-determination. Nasser's pan-Arabism sent shockwaves through Israel, challenging the narrative of a small, vulnerable state surrounded by hostile neighbors. The Israeli leadership, accustomed to Western support, viewed Nasser's growing influence with increasing alarm. They painted him as a threat to their very existence, using his rhetoric and the specter of a united Arab army to justify their own militarization. The Israeli narrative, often amplified by a sympathetic Western media, effectively portrayed Nasser as the aggressor. The 1956 Suez Crisis, a pivotal moment in the Arab-Israeli conflict, provided a stark illustration of the shifting power dynamics in the region. Nasser's bold move to nationalize the Suez Canal, a vital waterway for global trade, was met with swift and brutal retaliation from Israel, Britain, and France. While Israel, aided by its Western allies, emerged victorious from the Suez Crisis, it was a Pyrrhic victory. The conflict exposed the West's willingness to use force to protect its interests in the region and further fueled Arab resentment towards Israel. Despite the military defeat, Nasser emerged from the crisis with his reputation enhanced, having stood up to Western imperialism and survived. The years leading up to the Six-Day War witnessed a dangerous arms race as both Israel and its Arab neighbors poured resources into bolstering their military capabilities. The specter of another war loomed large, casting a long shadow over any hopes for a peaceful resolution. The arms race wasn't simply about acquiring weapons, it was about projecting strength, about deterring the other side from making the first move. But this delicate dance on the brink carried the constant risk of a misstep, of a miscalculation that could ignite the powder keg. The Arab-Israeli conflict became entangled in the broader Cold War rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union. Each superpower sought to bolster its allies in the region, providing military aid and diplomatic support, further fueling the arms race and exacerbating tensions. The involvement of the superpowers transformed the Arab-Israeli conflict into a proxy war, a dangerous game of chess played out on the backs of the people in the region. The search for allies often took precedence over the search for peace, as external actors pursued their own strategic interests. The superpowers' support for their respective allies emboldened both sides, making them less willing to compromise and more likely to resort to military force. By the spring of 1967, the Middle East resembled a powder keg, primed for explosion. Years of mistrust, military build-ups, and failed diplomatic efforts had created a volatile situation where even a minor incident could trigger a wider war. The stage was set for a confrontation, a clash of ideologies, ambitions, and historical grievances. The Six-Day War, when it finally erupted, would not be a bolt from the blue, it would be the inevitable consequence of decades of simmering conflict. The Strait of Tiran, a seemingly insignificant sliver of water that held immense strategic importance for Israel. Control over the strait meant control over Israel's access to the Red Sea, a lifeline for its economy and its military. When Egypt closed the Strait of Tiran to Israeli shipping in May 1967, Israel reacted with predictable outrage, claiming its very survival was at stake. Israel portrayed the closure as an act of aggression, an existential threat that justified a military response. As tensions escalated, the international community scrambled to find a diplomatic solution to avert a full-blown war. But the efforts proved futile, hampered by mistrust, miscommunication, and a lack of political will. Israel, emboldened by promises of support from the United States, saw an opportunity to solidify its control over the region by force. Some historians argue that Israel intentionally sabotaged diplomatic efforts, using the time bought by international negotiations to prepare for a military strike. On June 5, 1967, Israel launched a surprise attack on Egypt, catching its neighbor off guard and triggering the Six-Day War. The preemptive strike, meticulously planned and executed with devastating efficiency, shattered the region's fragile peace. Israel's decision to launch a preemptive strike, while often justified as a necessary act of self-defense, was a calculated gamble with far-reaching consequences. Operation Focus, a codename that would become synonymous with ruthlessness and military precision. In the early hours of June 5, 1967, Israeli warplanes unleashed their fury on Egypt's air force, catching them completely off guard. The element of surprise was crucial, allowing them to cripple Egypt's air defenses and seize control of the skies. Within hours, the balance of power had shifted dramatically. Egypt, once perceived as the strongest of Israel's Arab adversaries, found itself reeling from the initial blow, its air force decimated. With the skies under their control, Israeli ground forces wasted no time in pressing their advantage. Columns of tanks, spearheaded by elite armored units, surged across the Sinai, their objective the Suez Canal. The Egyptian army, caught off guard and outmaneuvered, fought bravely but were ultimately overwhelmed by Israel's superior firepower and tactics. The Israeli advance was relentless, a display of military efficiency that surprised even seasoned observers. Egyptian defenses crumbled under the weight of the assault. their soldiers, many of whom were poorly trained and ill-equipped, simply unable to match the ferocity and determination of the Israeli war machine. Within days, the Sinai Peninsula, a vast expanse of desert that had served as a buffer between Israel and Egypt, was firmly under Israeli control. While the battle for the Sinai raged in the south, Israeli forces launched a simultaneous offensive in the east, their objective East Jerusalem and the strategically vital Golan Heights. The capture of Jerusalem, a city imbued with religious and historical significance, would prove to be a turning point in the conflict. The capture of East Jerusalem, a city claimed by both Israelis and Palestinians as their capital, was a defining moment in the Six-Day War. It was a victory laden with religious and nationalistic symbolism, but it also marked the beginning of a new and even more contentious chapter in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. With Jerusalem secured, Israeli forces turned their attention north to the Golan Heights, a rocky plateau overlooking northern Israel. A fierce battle ensued, with Syrian forces putting up stiff resistance, but ultimately the Israelis, with their superior firepower and determination, prevailed. Despite the hardships they faced, the Palestinians never gave up hope. From the ashes of defeat rose a new generation, determined to resist the occupation, to reclaim their dignity, and to fight for their right to self-determination.
Palestinians endure the suffocating grip of occupation, their lives scarred by checkpoints, settlements, and violence. The Palestinian narrative is one of resilience and resistance, using protests, art, and civil disobedience to challenge the occupation and demand freedom. The first Intifada in 1987 was a collective cry for justice, uniting Palestinians in defiance and exposing the occupation's brutality to the world. The occupation's repression included arbitrary arrests, torture, and censorship, aiming to crush Palestinian resistance and spirit. Despite the occupation, Palestinians kept their identity and culture alive, using art and underground resistance to challenge their oppressors. The occupation's economic policies crippled Palestinian businesses, restricted resources, and created dependency, stifling economic growth. Many Palestinians work in Israel under exploitative conditions, facing long commutes, security checks, and discriminatory labor practices. The occupation hampers Palestinian education and healthcare, with underfunded schools and hospitals lacking essential resources, jeopardizing their future. A calculated system of deprivation. The economic hardship experienced by Palestinians is a deliberate strategy to maintain Israeli control. By controlling goods and movement, Israel benefits at the expense of Palestinians. The Palestinian economy, once vibrant, is now a shadow of its former self. Unemployment is high, poverty rampant, and hope for a prosperous future distant. The psychological toll breeds resentment and hopelessness. The international community's complicity is a stain on its conscience. The failure to hold Israel accountable emboldens its oppressive policies. Despite hardship, Palestinians resist economic strangulation. They hope for a future where their economy can flourish and their children have access to quality education and healthcare. Their resilience is a testament to the human spirit's ability to endure. By December 1987, the Palestinian territories resembled a tinderbox waiting for a spark. Decades of Israeli military occupation, land confiscation, and daily humiliations had taken their toll. The Palestinian people had reached a breaking point. The air crackled with a palpable tension. The world often overlooked the simmering frustration and anger. On December 8, 1987, an incident at the Erez checkpoint ignited the first Intifada. An Israeli truck collided with a van carrying Palestinian day laborers. 4 Palestinians were killed instantly. The news spread through the Jabalia refugee camp. Grief and rage erupted, seeing the deaths as another disregard for their lives. The incident became a symbol of Palestinian anger and frustration. The funerals of the Jabalia victims became a focal point for Palestinian grief and anger, transforming into mass demonstrations against the occupation. Thousands of Palestinians poured into the streets, their chants of mourning evolving into calls for resistance. The raw emotion on display signaled that something profound had shifted. Spontaneous outpourings of grief transformed into organized protests. Palestinian youth, armed with stones, took to the streets, fueled by a sense of injustice. The Israeli response was swift and brutal, with soldiers firing tear gas and live ammunition. The cycle of violence erupted into the open. The world takes notice. A people rise up against injustice. The Intifada gained momentum and the world watched. Palestinian resistance was being redefined, a non-violent struggle for freedom and justice. The international community faced pressure to act. Human rights organizations documented violations, journalists reported on the crackdown, public opinion shifted towards the Palestinian cause. The Intifada shattered the status quo. The Palestinian people captured the world's attention. The Intifada ignited a global conversation about justice. The Palestinian narrative found a voice on the global stage. The first Intifada altered the dynamics of the conflict. A nation awakens, the spirit of defiance. The first Intifada was not a pre-planned revolution orchestrated by political elites or armed factions. It was a spontaneous eruption of collective frustration, a primal scream against decades of dispossession and humiliation. It was the Palestinian people, in all their diversity, rising up to reclaim their dignity and their right to self-determination. Imagine the spirit of defiance that takes hold when a people, pushed to their limits, find the courage to say enough. Shopkeepers downed their shutters, students boycotted their classrooms, and farmers left their fields to join the demonstrations. The occupation, which had sought to atomize Palestinian society, had inadvertently brought them together in a shared struggle. The streets of Palestinian cities, towns, and villages transformed into spaces of resistance. The Palestinian flag, once a forbidden symbol, became a ubiquitous sign of defiance, flown from rooftops, painted on walls, and waved defiantly at demonstrations. The occupation, which had sought to erase Palestinian identity, had inadvertently fueled its resurgence. The world watched in awe as Palestinians, often perceived as passive victims of circumstance, found their voice and challenged their occupiers head-on. The first Intifada shattered the myth of Israeli invincibility, revealing the vulnerability of a military power confronted by the unwavering will of a people determined to be free. Beyond stones and slingshots, the power of a people united. The first Intifada was about a people finding strength and resilience in their collective spirit. It was a testament to the power of unity and shared sacrifice. Palestinians organized into local committees, taking on tasks made nearly impossible by the occupation. They established underground schools and clandestine health clinics, formed agricultural cooperatives to support farmers. The Intifada fostered self-reliance and community empowerment. The struggle for liberation became intertwined with a social revolution. The Intifada exposed the occupation's brutality and its inability to crush a united people. The role of women, mothers, daughters, leaders of resistance. The First Intifada revealed the strength and leadership of Palestinian women. They were active participants, organizing protests and providing essential support. Women played a pivotal role in underground networks. They smuggled food and information, risking their safety. They organized boycotts, promoting economic self-reliance. At home, they instilled a love for their homeland and justice. The Intifada empowered women, giving them a platform for social justice and gender equality. The youth take center stage. The First Intifada was a coming-of-age moment for an entire generation of Palestinian youth. Growing up under the shadow of Israeli military occupation, they witnessed injustices inflicted upon their families. The Intifada transformed their despair into a potent force for change. Armed with stones and slingshots, they faced heavily armed Israeli soldiers yearning for freedom. The Israeli authorities responded with brutal force, but the brutality only fueled their determination to be free. International impact. The Intifada captures the world's attention. The First Intifada, initially dismissed by some as a localized disturbance, quickly captured the world's attention. The Intifada also exposed the hypocrisy of many Western governments, which had long turned a blind eye to the plight of the Palestinians while supporting Israel's occupation. The pressure from their own citizens, moved by the images of Palestinian resistance, forced these governments to re-evaluate their policies and to acknowledge the legitimacy of Palestinian demands for self-determination. The First Intifada, though ultimately unsuccessful in achieving its immediate goals, had a profound impact on the trajectory of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It shattered the status quo, internationalized the Palestinian narrative, and paved the way for a new era of Palestinian resistance and international engagement. A nation on edge, fear, and the siege mentality. The eruption of the First Intifada sent shockwaves through Israeli society, shattering the illusion of control and security that had been carefully constructed over decades. The sight of Palestinians, once perceived as a passive and defeated population, rising up in unison against the occupation, shook the foundations of the Israeli psyche. For many Israelis, the Intifada was a jarring wake-up call, a stark reminder that their grip on the occupied territories was far more tenuous than they had allowed themselves to believe. The Palestinian people, long dismissed as a non-entity, had found their voice, and their message was one of defiance and a determination to be free. The daily rhythms of life in Israel were disrupted as the spectre of violence became a constant companion. Palestinian attacks, while often portrayed as indiscriminate acts of terror, were a desperate response to years of oppression, a cry for help that had been met with silence and indifference by the world. The Israeli occupation, caught off guard by the intensity and sophistication of the uprising, reacted with a mixture of confusion and fear. The old playbook, relying on brute force and repression, seemed inadequate in the face of a popular uprising that transcended traditional political and organizational structures. The iron fist, crushing the uprising at any cost. The Israeli occupation resorted to overwhelming force to crush the Intifada and reassert control. The IDF faced urban warfare, clashing with stone-throwing youths and unarmed protesters. Their response was often brutal, blurring lines between law enforcement and collective punishment. Palestinian homes were raided, villages under curfew, and communities faced blockades. Tear gas, rubber bullets, and live ammunition against unarmed protesters became commonplace. The Israeli occupation justified its actions as a war against terrorism. Palestinian demands for self-determination were dismissed as illegitimate. Shifting narratives, justifying the unjustifiable. As the Intifada gained international attention, the Israeli government launched a sophisticated propaganda campaign designed to control the narrative and justify its brutal response. Palestinian resistance was framed as inherently violent and driven by an irrational hatred of Israel, their legitimate grievances dismissed as mere pretexts for terrorism. The Israeli media, often complicit in this effort, amplified the government's narrative, portraying Palestinians as dangerous fanatics bent on Israel's destruction. The complexities of the conflict, the root causes of Palestinian anger and frustration, were rarely acknowledged. The Israeli government, skilled in the art of public diplomacy, effectively exploited Western fears of terrorism and anti-Semitism, portraying itself as a beleaguered democracy fighting for its very survival against implacable enemies. This narrative resonated with many, particularly in the United States, where support for Israel remained strong. The Palestinian narrative, often drowned out by the Israeli propaganda machine, struggled to find a foothold in the global media. The voices of ordinary Palestinians, their stories of dispossession, humiliation and resilience, were rarely heard. International pressure mounts, a nation under scrutiny. The brutality of the Israeli response to the First Intifada began to erode Israel's image as a benevolent democracy. The world was forced to confront the human cost of Israel's policies. International human rights organizations issued scathing reports condemning the IDF's excessive use of force, the widespread practice of administrative detention, and the systematic demolition of Palestinian homes. The Israeli occupation attempts to dismiss these reports rang increasingly hollow. The First Intifada marked a turning point in the international community's perception of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Scars of resistance, a people transformed. The First Intifada, though ultimately unsuccessful in achieving its immediate goal of ending the Israeli occupation, left an indelible mark on the Palestinian psyche. It was a watershed moment, a collective awakening that transformed a dispersed and seemingly defeated people into a unified force determined to control their own destiny. The uprising, fueled by the sacrifices of ordinary men, women and children, shattered the myth of Palestinian passivity and exposed the brutality of the occupation to the world. It was a testament to the power of collective action, demonstrating that even in the face of overwhelming military might, the human spirit's yearning for freedom cannot be extinguished. The Intifada's legacy extended far beyond the immediate political sphere. It fostered a sense of national consciousness, uniting Palestinians across geographic and ideological divides. It empowered a new generation, forging a collective identity rooted in resistance, resilience, and an unwavering belief in their right to self-determination. The scars of the Intifada ran deep, etched into the collective memory of a people who had witnessed firsthand the brutality of the occupation and the transformative power of their own resistance. It was a period of immense suffering, but also one of profound growth and a reaffirmation of their unwavering commitment to a future free from oppression. The First Intifada created a vacuum in Palestinian politics, shaking the foundations of the existing leadership structures and paving the way for the emergence of new actors, most notably Hamas, an Islamic movement that rejected the secular nationalism of the Palestine Liberation Organization, or PLO. Hamas, born out of the despair and frustration of the occupied territories, offered a more uncompromising stance towards Israel, advocating for armed resistance as the only viable path to liberation. The rise of Hamas, often perceived as a liberation movement by many Palestinians, began against the backdrop of growing frustration over Israeli occupation and perceived betrayals by other Palestinian leadership. Founded in 1987 during the First Intifada, a Palestinian uprising against Israeli military occupation, Hamas positioned itself as a steadfast defender of Palestinian rights. The group's origins can be traced to the Muslim Brotherhood, which provided a foundation in religious ideology and opposition to both Israeli occupation and the perceived failures of secular Palestinian groups like the PLO. Hamas gained prominence by portraying itself as unyielding in its resistance to Israeli control over Palestinian lands. Unlike the PLO, which had engaged in negotiations with Israel, culminating in the Oslo Accords, Hamas rejected any form of compromise that would recognize Israeli sovereignty. To the Palestinians, especially those who had grown disillusioned with the Oslo process, Hamas's message resonated deeply. The movement's blend of armed resistance and grassroots social services won them loyalty from the population in Gaza and beyond. By 2006, Hamas's popularity had surged to the extent that they won a majority in the Palestinian Legislative Council elections, surprising much of the international community. This victory was seen by many Palestinians as a rejection of the failed peace processes and a move towards more assertive leadership in their struggle against Israeli occupation. Israel, however, responded with intensified military actions, viewing Hamas as a threat due to their refusal to disarm and recognize the State of Israel. From the outset, Hamas framed its actions as legitimate resistance against an occupying power that had consistently violated international law and imposed a brutal regime of control and segregation on the Palestinian people. Israel, on the other hand, described Hamas as a terrorist organization to the international community, a label which allowed Israel to justify military strikes on Gaza, where Hamas maintained its stronghold. The disproportionate responses by Israel, which resulted in high civilian casualties, further solidified Hamas's image as freedom fighters defending Palestinian dignity. The rise of Hamas also highlighted the deep divisions between different Palestinian factions. As they consolidated power in Gaza, the Israeli blockade and repeated military offensives left the Strip in a perpetual state of humanitarian crisis. Despite these conditions, Hamas's military wing, the Izz ad-Din al-Qassam brigades, continued to operate, launching rocket attacks in response to Israeli airstrikes and the encroachment of settlements in the West Bank. To many Palestinians, Hamas represents resistance to decades of subjugation, expulsion, and suffering under Israeli occupation. They view Hamas's actions as a defense of Palestinian rights to self-determination, standing up against an occupying force that has consistently disregarded international resolutions, imposed blockades, and engaged in practices such as house demolitions, land seizures, and collective punishment. To this day, Hamas remains a symbol of resistance for many, determined to challenge Israel's narrative and their occupation policies. The movement's popularity grew rapidly, particularly in the impoverished and densely populated Gaza Strip, where it provided essential social services and tapped into the growing disillusionment with the PLO's perceived failures. The rise of Hamas complicated the already intractable Israeli-Palestinian conflict, adding a new layer of complexity to the political landscape. Israel, which had long viewed the PLO as its primary adversary, now faced less predictable opponent, one that rejected the Oslo peace process and refused to recognize Israel's right to exist. The international community, grappling with the implications of Hamas's rise, struggled to formulate a coherent response. The movement's use of violence against Israeli civilians, while widely condemned, was often seen as a symptom of the occupation's brutality and the absence of any viable political horizon for the Palestinian people. The First Intifada, despite its ultimate failure to end the occupation, had a profound impact on the trajectory of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It forced Israel to acknowledge the unsustainability of the status quo and paved the way for the Oslo Accords, a series of agreements signed in the 1990s that aimed to resolve the conflict through a negotiated two-state solution. The Oslo Accords, hailed by some as a historic breakthrough, raised hopes for a lasting peace, but they also sowed the seeds of future conflict. The agreements, riddled with ambiguity and deferring crucial issues like Jerusalem, settlements and refugees to future negotiations, failed to address the root causes of the conflict, the occupation, the denial of Palestinian self-determination, and the deep mistrust that permeated both societies. The Oslo period, marked by a mix of hope and disillusionment, ultimately failed to deliver on its promise of a just and lasting peace. The Israeli government, under pressure from its right wing, continued to expand settlements in the occupied territories, while the Palestinian Authority, weak and corrupt, struggled to exert control over its fragmented territories. The Oslo Accords, while intended to pave the way for a two-state solution, inadvertently created a situation where the occupation became more entrenched and the prospects for a viable Palestinian state seemed increasingly remote. The failure of the Oslo peace process and the Second Intifada ushered in a new phase in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The occupation evolved into a sophisticated system of control with barriers, checkpoints, and administrative procedures. The separation barrier became a potent symbol of this new phase. It annexed large swathes of Palestinian land, separating families and cutting off communities. Daily life is characterized by uncertainty, humiliation, and struggle for basic necessities.
Suddenly, the morning calm explodes. Once again, deafening roar of fighter jets pierces the air. The ground trembles as bombs rain down, turning homes into rubble. The peace is shattered, replaced by the terror of war. On October 7, 2023, Hamas launched a large-scale attack on Israel, marking a significant escalation in the ongoing conflict between Palestinians and Israelis. This event, however, must be viewed through the lens of the broader struggle that Palestinians have faced for decades under occupation. The coordinated assault by Hamas, which included breaching Israel's heavily fortified border, was an extension of the Palestinian resistance against the ongoing blockade of Gaza, illegal settlements, and years of oppression and displacement. Hamas fighters used a variety of methods, including bulldozers and tunnels, to break through the border, a symbol of the isolation and confinement Palestinians experience daily in Gaza. The barrage of rockets launched at Israeli cities, including Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, was a response to the constant bombardment and airstrikes Gaza has endured for years, which have targeted civilian infrastructure, killing thousands of innocent Palestinians, including women and children. The infiltration into Israeli towns and military bases by Palestinian resistance fighters aimed to disrupt military operations that continually target Gaza, where Palestinians live under constant threat of violence. The capture of Israeli civilians and soldiers was portrayed by Hamas as an act of resistance, aiming to bring attention to the thousands of Palestinians, including children, who are imprisoned without trial in Israeli jails. These actions are part of a larger context of ongoing resistance by Palestinians against occupation, displacement, and the denial of basic human rights. For Palestinians, this resistance is often viewed as a necessary response to decades of aggression, land theft, and the humanitarian crisis created by the Israeli blockade. It explores the motivations behind Hamas's surprise attack, framed as a response to Israeli military actions, settler expansions, and the desecration of holy sites like the Al-Aqsa Mosque. The attack is contextualized as part of a larger, ongoing struggle for Palestinian freedom rather than an isolated act of aggression. October 7, 2023, a day etched in the memory of every Palestinian. A day that began like any other, but ended with the world forever changed. For on this day, Hamas, the Palestinian resistance group, launched a daring and desperate attack on Israel. The world called it an act of aggression, a provocation. But for the Palestinians, it was a cry for liberation, a last-ditch effort to break free from the chains of oppression. Israel's response was immediate and devastating. Airstrikes rained down upon Gaza, reducing anything in the way. The disproportionate civilian casualties, particularly among women and children, journalists, medical workers, are brought to the forefront. Emotional stories from families who have lost loved ones provide a human face to the statistics. The destruction of homes, United Nations schools and hospitals symbolizes the ongoing struggle for survival against overwhelming odds. Since October 7, 2023, more than 10,000 Palestinian children and at least 115 journalists has been killed. This period has become the deadliest for minors and journalists in recent history. Also, media workers facing immense risks while reporting on the ground, including targeted attacks despite being clearly marked as press. The ongoing conflict between Israel and Hamas has led to significant destruction of civilian infrastructure in Gaza. 203+ schools have been destroyed, 32+ hospitals have been damaged or destroyed, 47+ mosques have been destroyed, 3+ churches have been damaged or destroyed. Additionally, the rape of Palestinian prisoners, men, women and children in Israeli detention centers is a deeply disturbing and widely condemned human rights violation. Reports and testimonies from former detainees, human rights organizations, and legal advocates indicate that sexual violence is used as a tool of humiliation, coercion, and psychological torture. This abuse often occurs during interrogations to extract confessions or force cooperation, with victims suffering severe trauma and stigmatization in their communities. Additionally, this abuse has been largely underreported due to fear of retaliation, shame, and the lack of legal recourse within a system that many Palestinians perceive as biased against them. These actions constitute clear violations of international law, particularly the Geneva Conventions and the Convention Against Torture, which prohibits such inhumane treatment of prisoners. The world watched in horror as the death toll mounted, the vast majority of them innocent civilians. The attack on October 7th and Israel's subsequent retaliation trigger wider regional tensions. Hezbollah in Lebanon, Iran, Yemen, and other regional actors became involved, further escalating the conflict. Protests erupt across the Arab world and globally, as Palestinians draw attention to their plight. The narrative here emphasizes the global nature of the Palestinian struggle for justice and the widespread international solidarity with their cause. The sky over Gaza turned into a canvas of fire. Israeli fighter jets armed with the latest technology rained down missiles with terrifying precision. Buildings, once symbols of hope and progress, crumbled into dust. The earth shook and the air crackled with the sound of explosions. Each explosion sent shockwaves through the densely populated city. Gaza, already reeling from years of blockade, was transformed into an open-air prison. The borders were sealed, trapping millions of Palestinians within a war zone. Escape was impossible. Survival became a luxury few could afford. Food, water, and medicine, the lifelines of a besieged population, dwindled with each passing day.
Amidst the rubble and despair, a cry for humanity echoed across the globe. The scenes of devastation were heart-wrenching, with entire neighborhoods reduced to ruins. Families searched desperately for loved ones, and the air was thick with grief and uncertainty. Humanitarian aid workers, risking their lives, worked tirelessly to provide relief and support to those in dire need. From the streets of London to the heart of New York City, people of all faiths and backgrounds rallied in solidarity with the Palestinian people. The protests were a powerful display of unity, with diverse crowds coming together to demand justice and peace. Signs and banners carried messages of hope, resistance, and a call for an end to the violence. The global outpouring of support was a testament to the shared humanity that transcends borders and cultures. The images of carnage in Gaza, beamed across the world by news channels, sparked outrage and condemnation. News anchors and journalists reported from the front lines, bringing the harsh realities of the conflict into living rooms worldwide. The graphic footage and harrowing stories of those affected stirred emotions and prompted urgent calls for action. The relentless coverage ensured that the plight of the Palestinian people could not be ignored. Politicians, celebrities, and ordinary citizens alike raised their voices, demanding an end to the bloodshed. Speeches were made in parliaments and public squares, with leaders urging for immediate ceasefires and humanitarian aid. Celebrities used their platforms to amplify the message, joining protests and speaking out on social media. The collective cry for peace resonated across continents, highlighting the urgent need for a resolution to the conflict. Social media became a platform for sharing stories of resilience, of hope, and of loss. People from around the world posted heartfelt messages, shared personal experiences, and spread awareness about the situation in Gaza. Emotional testimonials and videos went viral, capturing the strength and spirit of those enduring unimaginable hardships. The digital solidarity created a sense of global community, united in the pursuit of peace and justice for the Palestinian people.
The lifeline of Gaza, already fragile, now lay in ruins. The relentless bombardment had crippled the already struggling infrastructure. Water treatment plants, power grids, and sanitation systems all lay in ruins. Israel's response was swift and devastating. The Israeli Defense Forces, IDF, launched retaliatory airstrikes on Gaza, targeting schools, mosques, churches, journalists, children, and civilians. The airstrikes caused extensive damage across Gaza, including residential areas, hospitals, and schools. Thousands of Palestinians were killed in the strikes, and the civilian toll quickly escalated as the conflict continued. While they continue to bomb civilians, Israel has imposed severe restrictions on humanitarian aid entering Gaza. Since the conflict escalated on October 7, 2023, Israel has maintained a blockade on Gaza, restricting the entry of essential humanitarian aid, including food, medical supplies, and fuel. Although limited aid has been allowed in at various points through negotiations, the amount has been insufficient to meet the overwhelming needs of Gaza's civilian population. The blockade has been widely criticized for exacerbating the humanitarian crisis in Gaza, where over 2 million people have been left without adequate food, water, or medical care. According to reports, Israel airstrikes have damaged Palestine's water systems, leaving large portions of Gaza's population without access to clean water. The destruction of water treatment plants, pipelines, and pumping stations, combined with the blockade that restricts the repair of these facilities, has led to a severe water crisis. Many Gaza residents have been forced to rely on unsafe water sources, increasing the risk of waterborne and many other diseases. These actions have drawn widespread international condemnation, with calls for Israel to allow the unhindered delivery of humanitarian aid and to protect civilian infrastructure in accordance with international law. But Israel refused to recognize international laws and continue their genocidal agenda. The bombs keeps falling and the suffering continued. Thirst and hunger, the silent killers, stalked the streets of Gaza, claiming their victims slowly, silently, but no less mercilessly. Clean water, once taken for granted, became a luxury few could afford. The ongoing humanitarian crisis takes center stage in this documentary. The blockade, which was already crippling Gaza, is further tightened after the escalation, cutting off vital humanitarian aid. Aid workers describe the challenges of delivering food, medicine, and water to a besieged population, while residents describe the dire conditions they face daily. The destruction of water and power infrastructure has left millions of Palestinians without access to basic necessities. Children are starving to death. International condemnation is discussed, but the focus remains on the plight of the people trapped in Gaza. The situation described violates several principles of international law, specifically regarding the treatment of civilians during armed conflict and the provision of humanitarian aid. Geneva Conventions, 1949. These conventions, particularly the Fourth Geneva Convention, protect civilians in times of war. Under Article 33, collective punishment is prohibited, and the deliberate targeting or cutting off of essential services, such as water, food, and medical supplies to civilians, could be considered a form of collective punishment. The destruction of critical infrastructure, especially when it directly affects civilians, can also violate Article 53, which forbids the destruction of property unless absolutely necessary for military operations. Customary international humanitarian law, IHL. Rule 55 of IHL obligates parties in a conflict to allow and facilitate rapid and unimpeded passage of humanitarian relief for civilians in need. Cutting off humanitarian aid, food, water, and medicine would breach these obligations. Rule 14 also emphasizes that starvation of the civilian population as a method of warfare is prohibited. International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, and ICCR. Article 11 recognizes the right of everyone to an adequate standard of living, including food, clothing and housing, and to the continuous improvement of living conditions. Cutting off access to basic necessities, as described, would infringe on this right. UN Security Council resolutions. Various resolutions have called for the protection of civilians during conflicts, especially in Gaza. The UN Security Council has repeatedly condemned actions that result in humanitarian crises, such as the deliberate targeting of civilian infrastructure and blockades that prevent access to basic needs. Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court from 1998. Deliberate actions that cause widespread suffering or serious injury to civilians may constitute war crimes. Article 8, 2b, Gesetzesviv, explicitly mentions the act of intentionally using starvation of civilians as a method of warfare as a war crime. Therefore, the tightening of the blockade, destruction of infrastructure, and the prevention of humanitarian aid from reaching Gaza could be seen as violations of international humanitarian law and human rights law. These actions not only contribute to a humanitarian crisis, but also contradict the legal obligations of conflict parties to protect civilians and ensure their access to life-sustaining resources. Echoes of trauma, scars that run deep. The physical wounds may heal, but the psychological scars of the conflict ran deep. The relentless bombardment, the loss of loved ones, the constant fear and uncertainty, all had taken their toll. Children, their innocence shattered by the horrors they had witnessed, struggled to comprehend the violence that had engulfed their lives. The world turns a blind eye. The international community, as always, responded with a mixture of condemnation and inaction. World leaders issued their now familiar calls for restraint and a return to the negotiating table. But their words rang hollow in the ears of the Palestinians, who had heard it all before. The United Nations, paralyzed by internal divisions, proved once again incapable of effective action. A world's indifference, Gaza forgotten. As the dust settled and the cameras moved on, a sense of weary resignation settled over Gaza. The world had condemned the violence, had pledged aid and support, but had it truly understood the depth of their suffering? The promises of reconstruction rang hollow in the ears of those who had lost everything. The media's lens framing the narrative. The media, once considered the watchdog of democracy and the voice of the voiceless, became complicit in something far darker. As the crisis unfolded, majority of mainstream news networks rushed to cover the conflict, their cameras capturing only the curated fragments of war. But behind the facade of breaking news and frontline reporting, there was a different battle raging, a battle for narrative control. In newsrooms, anchors and reporters worked tirelessly to deliver updates that were carefully crafted and sanitized for the masses. Journalists on the ground, often facing real danger, were frequently constrained by the selective editing and omission of critical context. Meanwhile, producers and editors sifted through hours of footage, not to inform, but to shape a predetermined story. The pressure wasn't to report the unvarnished truth, it was to control public perception. Every frame, every word and every image was filtered through a lens that prioritized the interests of governments and corporations over the real, uncensored realities of war. Beyond traditional new outlets, social media platforms became battlegrounds for competing narratives. Citizen journalists and everyday individuals shared their own stories and perspectives, adding to the cacophony of voices. Hashtags trended, videos went viral, and opinions clashed in the digital arena. The sheer volume of information made it challenging to discern fact from fiction, truth from propaganda. Meanwhile, the printing presses of major newspapers and magazines worked relentlessly, not to inform but to push pre-packaged narratives tailored to suit corporate sponsors and political agendas. Editorial boards, far from debating ethics, often dismissed the responsibility to inform the public truthfully in favor of sensationalism, half-truths, and omission. The real story was buried beneath layers of spin, as the media became a willing accomplice in framing the conflict to fit the preferred narrative of those in power. In this landscape, the media's role as observer was overshadowed by its function as a participant in a well-orchestrated propaganda machine. The battle to control the narrative was not about truth, but about crafting an understanding of the crisis that served the interests of a select few, influencing international opinion and policy in the process. Beyond the headlines, the human cost of conflict. While the world grappled with the political complexities and the media's often conflicting narratives, it was the ordinary people caught in the crossfire who bore the brunt of the conflict. These individuals, whose lives were upended in an instant, faced unimaginable hardships. They were forced to leave behind their homes, their memories, and their dreams, seeking refuge in uncertain and often hostile environments. The resilience of these people, however, shone through the darkest of times. Their stories, often relegated to the back pages or lost amidst the political grandstanding, painted a stark and poignant picture of the human cost of war. Each face told a story of loss, of pain, and of an unyielding spirit. The elderly, who had seen their homes destroyed, clung to memories of a peaceful past. Mothers with tear-streaked faces held their children close, trying to shield them from the horrors that surrounded them. Children, their innocence snatched away by the horrors they had witnessed, bore the invisible scars of trauma. They played amidst the rubble, their laughter a stark contrast to the devastation around them. Yet behind their eyes one could see the weight of their experiences. These young souls, who should have been carefree and full of joy, were forced to grow up too soon. Their haunted expressions spoke volumes about the impact of the conflict on their tender minds. The human cost of conflict is not just measured in lives lost, but in the shattered dreams and broken spirits of those who survive. The international legal efforts to hold Israel accountable for its actions. Also, the ongoing investigations by the ICC and other international bodies into potential war crimes committed by Israeli leaders. It highlights the frustration of Palestinians who feel that despite the mounting evidence of atrocities, justice remains elusive. Legal experts discuss the challenges of pursuing accountability in a world that often prioritizes political alliances over human rights. The International Criminal Court, ICC, has issued applications for arrest warrants for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant. These applications, filed by ICC prosecutor Karim Khan in May 2024, allege that Netanyahu and Gallant are responsible for war crimes and crimes against humanity, particularly in Gaza, since October 7, 2023. The charges include the starvation of civilians, direct attacks on civilians, and other grave breaches of international law, OI citation. 2. ICC seeking arrest warrants for Hamas leaders and Israel's Netanyahu. However, these applications still need to be reviewed and approved by the ICC's pre-trial chamber before arrest warrants can be officially issued. If approved, the warrants would be legally binding in countries that are members of the ICC. Whispers of resilience, life amidst the ruins. Even amidst the ruins, life in Gaza found a way. The resilience of the human spirit, tested time and again by adversity, refused to be extinguished. We demand justice not just for what has been done, but to ensure that it never happens again. Palestinian lawyer. Seeds of hope rebuilding shattered dreams. From the ashes of destruction, seeds of hope began to sprout. International aid organizations, their efforts often hampered by the ongoing blockade and political complexities, worked tirelessly to provide essential supplies, medical care, and shelter to those most in need. Local communities, their bonds strengthened by shared hardship, came together to support one another. A generation rises, the unbreakable spirit. A new generation, born into conflict but not defined by it, rose from the ashes. They had witnessed firsthand the horrors of war, the loss of loved ones, the destruction of their homes and dreams, but they refused to be consumed by hatred or despair. A world's responsibility, breaking the silence. The conflict in Gaza, with its heart-wrenching images of destruction and despair, has once again exposed the world's conscience to the plight of the Palestinian people. But as the dust settles and the cameras move on, the question remains, will the world stand idly by, content to offer words of sympathy while the cycle of violence continues unabated? The answer, if history is any guide, is far from certain. Justice delayed, justice denied, the urgency of now. The Palestinian people have endured decades of occupation, displacement and dispossession. Their land has been confiscated, their homes demolished, their lives shattered by a conflict that seems to have no end. Yet, despite the hardships they have faced, their spirit remains unbroken, their hope for a better future undimmed. For Palestinians, these events are central to their narrative of dispossession and exile. They are a reminder of the injustice inflicted upon them, a wound that continues to bleed, a call for recognition and justice.
Despite facing unimaginable hardship, enduring decades of dispossession, occupation and violence, the Palestinian people have never relinquished their dream of freedom and self-determination. Their story is one of remarkable resilience, a testament to the human spirit's ability to endure even in the face of overwhelming adversity. From the ashes of the Nakba to the streets of the Intifadas, from the negotiating tables to the cultural sphere, Palestinians have found countless ways to resist, to preserve their identity, and to keep the flame of hope alive. Their struggle, though often overlooked or distorted by the dominant narratives, stands as a beacon for all those around the world fighting for justice, equality, and the right to determine their own destinies. The Palestinian narrative is not just a story of suffering and dispossession, it's a story of resilience, creativity, and an unwavering belief in the power of hope. It's a story that challenges us to confront injustice, to amplify marginalized voices, and to never lose faith in the possibility of a better future. A future where all people, regardless of their ethnicity, religion, or nationality, can live together in peace and dignity.